The era between 1790 and 1820s goes by many names, and the dates will shift slightly depending on the particular country you study. British history calls this time the Georgian and Regency periods after the mad King George, who lost the American colonies. His son George IV eventually had to rule in his place as regent. We begin this era in 1790 because that is the beginning of the end for aristocratic government in France and the start of the French Revolution. We will see wars all over Europe and their colonies during this time. The reading in our Tortora textbook contains a good summary of American, English, and French history during this time, but it omits some important benchmarks in New World history: the War for Independence against Spain in Mexico, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And for all you Hamilton fans, this is the era when Hamilton died in 1804. Although every country has different political terms for this time, when we talk about the style of this era in dress, decor, art, and architecture, we use the term neoclassical. Neoclassical refers to a classical revival. The struggles for independence will bring about new fashions evoking the styles of ancient Greece, thought to be the birthplace of democracy. We will see two classical revivals, the democratic one based on ancient Greece. The second one was favored by Napoleon. It blended motifs from ancient Rome and Egypt. We will look at four themes in this presentation today. The overall themes will be the new fashion. This is the rise of democracy in dress. At the time, it was called the new man. We'll look at classical revivals. This is the first fashion revival in costume history, and it will be Greek and Roman. The gender split. Men will step out of the fashion parade during this time, and women will assume fashion as social status. And we will trace trade and cross-culturalism. Most interestingly in this period, India, Persia, and Egypt will come to the forefront. During this era, we see the European countries consolidating their global trade interests into corporations, just as they had done with the Hudson Bay Company in North America during the 18th century. This time, they will turn their attentions toward India, establishing factories in India to make goods solely for export to Europe. This great expansion of colonialism will greatly increase the amount of goods available and make them a little more affordable. And it is worth noting these are corporations that were given vast powers over land and people. Another factor that will influence fashion is the beginning of revolutions in the Ottoman Empire, vast territories owned by what is today Turkey. European countries will be constantly embroiled in skirmishes and alliances. Just like we talk about the Cold War with Russia in the 20th century, at the time Europeans called this the Eastern Question. Europe will look to Turkey as a source for exotic influences that will directly influence fashion. European society severely divided among supporters of the Ancien regime, or the old aristocratic way, and the new way brought on by the Enlightenment, using democracy and science as benchmarks for social thought, not inherited nobility and autocratic rule. Fashion shifted nearly overnight to search for a new way of dressing. This political cartoon from the era illustrates that you can take one look at the way someone dressed and see their political opinions. While women's fashions easily adopted to a Greek classical revival, attempts to do the same for men were not successful. There was a very short-lived experiment in France only to bring back the tunics of the classical world, but they proved unworkable for modern lives. Instead, men turned to the coat and hat of the riding suit, or habit, as it's called. Aristocratic men wore breeches that ended at the knee, but the working classes did not. They wore long trousers that were the sign of a laborer or a sailor. In fact, the extreme revolutionaries in France were called the sans culottes, or without breeches. Over time, wealthy men adopted these trousers. You will see for some time a crossover transition of traditional conservative men wearing breeches and progressive men wearing trousers. This is an important moment in fashion history, when men step out of the fashion parade. While women's fashions will undergo wild changes, men's suits from now on will evolve very slowly over the next 230 years. Fashion historian Anne Hollander makes the case that this is the true definition of classical fashion, something that endures through time. Let's look at the shapes and silhouettes we will see during the neoclassical fashion. Silhouette number 1 is a transition period during the French Revolution starting about 1790. The ideal shape for men is slender and youthful, perhaps to state that this is a younger generation who will shape the new future. Faces and hair will be round. The body will resemble long rectangles or a narrow H shape. Women's fashions immediately lose their understructures and paniers, deflating to round and A shapes. We can see the hem is wider than the waist or the shoulders. The rounded shapes are supported by a pad that was worn in back called a cork rump or a false rump. This is worn under the skirt. Several political opinions made their way into fashion trends. This style, for instance, is called à la patriotique for those who supported the French Revolution, featuring red, white, and blue colors under the new flag. For those who supported the monarchy, there was a fad protesting the death of aristocrats or a way of life, and this featured red for blood, black for mourning, and white for innocence dying at the hands of terrorist revolutionaries. There was a more extreme form of protest called à la sauvage. That was the punk movement of its day. Sauvage styles featured hair chopped off as if you were being led to the guillotine, and red or black ribbons or jewelry around the neck to imitate the cut of the guillotine. Silhouette number 2 is the true neoclassical ideal from about 1804 to the 1820s. The silhouette remains essentially the same for men, the H shape, and now the women's shape matches that. The woman's skirt hem is about the same width as her shoulders. There is little emphasis on the woman's waist. It is now very high, just under the bust line. Although the general outside silhouette is rectangular, both silhouettes 1 and 2 will feature round shapes around the face and the necklines. Men will begin wearing their jackets open at the collar to create a strong triangular shape. So the overall themes that we will be looking at through this unit are the new fashion, the rise of democratic dress and the new man, classical revivals, the gender split when men step out of the fashion parade, and trade and cross-culturalism for India, Persia, and Egyptian motifs and fashions to influence Western fashion. This concludes our overview of the neoclassical style.